Did you know that World War II actually started long before 1939? In fact, a forgotten conflict known as the Second Sino-Japanese War played a significant role in shaping the course of history. From 1937 to 1945, China and Japan were locked in a brutal and often overlooked war. Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937–45, conflict that broke out when China began a full-scale resistance to the expansion of Japanese influence in its territory, which had begun in 1931. The war, which remained undeclared until December 9, 1941, may be divided into three phases: a period of rapid Japanese advance until the end of 1938, a period of virtual stalemate until 1944, and the final period when Allied counterattacks, principally in the Pacific and on Japan's home islands, brought about Japan's surrender. The establishment of Manchukuo and the creation of the United Front. For much of the early 20th century, Japan had exercised effective control of Manchuria, initially through the terms of the 21 Demands, 1915, and later through its support of Chinese warlord Zhang Zuolin. However, a serious conflict was developing, and the Chinese in Manchuria were especially restive under the privileges held by the Japanese. Chinese citizens formed the vast majority of the population, and the legal title of the region was held by China. Yet Japan controlled much of South Manchuria through its railways and its leasehold on the Liaodong Peninsula and in other ways that compromised Chinese sovereignty. In an attempt to assert their independence, the Chinese began building a series of railroads that would in part encircle the Japanese lines and terminate at Huladao, a port which the Chinese were developing. Zhang Shuiliang, Zhang Zuolin's son and the ruler of Manchuria after his father's murder by Japanese officers in 1928, was increasingly disposed to ally himself with the Kuomintang, Nationalist Party, and its desire to rid China of foreign control. In the summer of 1931, the friction expressed itself in minor incidents. Those in control of the main body of Japanese forces in Manchuria believed that the time had passed for temporizing and compromise. On the night of September 18–19, 1931, alleging that Chinese had blown up part of the track of the South Manchuria Railway near the city, the Japanese seized Mukden, Shenyang. Facing little resistance from nationalist forces, the Japanese established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932 and installed the deposed Qing Emperor Puyi as its titular head. Japan soon demonstrated that it was not content with confining its control of China to regions north of the Great Wall, and in the spring of 1934 a pronouncement from Tokyo in effect declared all China to be a Japanese preserve in which no power could take important action without its consent. In 1935 the Japanese forced the withdrawal from Hebei and Shahar, now part of Inner Mongolia, of any officials and armed forces that might prove unfriendly to Japan. These territories passed partly into Japanese control, and Suiyuan, Shanxi, Shaanxi, and Shantung, Shandong, were threatened. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek did not offer open opposition, preferring instead to pursue his campaign against Chinese Communist forces. In December 1936, in what came to be known as the Xi'an Incident, Chiang was seized by forces under the command of his own generals and compelled to ally with the Communists in a united front against Japan. World Wars. What proved to be a life-and-death struggle soon broke out between China and Japan. The opening engagement was a minor clash between Chinese and Japanese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, not far from Peiping, Beijing, on July 7, 1937. The conflict quickly ceased to be localized. The Japanese came to feel that since Chiang and the nationalist government would not yield to their wishes, they must be eliminated. To the Japanese, the rising tide of nationalism in China, directed, as much of it was, against them, had become intolerable. Initial Japanese conquests. By July 1937 practically all Chinese regional military and political groups had rallied to support the nationalist government and Chiang Kai-shek in their decision to oppose Japan by every means. The Communists, who had urged a united front against Japan since 1935, pledged their support and put their armies nominally under command of the government. From a strictly military point of view, however, Japan was so much better prepared than China that its armies achieved rapid initial success. Within the course of 2 years Japan obtained possession of most of the ports, the majority of the chief cities as far west as Hankow, Hankou, and the larger part of the railways. Peiping and Tientsin, Tianjin, were occupied in July 1937. After fierce fighting, the Chinese armies were driven out of the Shanghai area by the middle of November 1937. Nanking, Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell in mid-December 1937, and the liquidation of that city and its inhabitants became known as the Nanjing Massacre. As many as 300,000 Chinese civilians and surrendered troops were killed. Moreover, tens of thousands of women were raped on the orders of Japanese commander Matsui Iwang. The capital was moved west to Hankow. The Japanese followed and took that city in October 1938. In the same month, the Chinese lost Canton, Guangzhou. The Japanese pressed northward and westward from Piping along the railway lines into Shanxi and Inner Mongolia. They dominated Shantung and took possession of the Piping-Hankow, Tientsin-Puku, and Lunghai railways and of the rail lines in the lower part of the Yangtze Valley. They had complete command of the sea. Always superior in the air, before many months they had all but destroyed the Chinese Air Force and bombed Chinese cities at will. The loss of life, particularly for the Chinese, was enormous. Pacific War. Japanese-controlled areas of China. Yet the Chinese did not yield, and the war was prolonged far beyond Japan's expectations. Chiang Kai-shek moved his capital to Chongqing, Chongqing, in Sichuan, at the western end of the Yangtze Gorges. Much of China's leadership migrated to the far west, to Sichuan and Yunnan. Unoccupied China prepared for prolonged resistance. In occupied China, Japan was unsuccessful in inducing many Chinese to take office in the governments that it endeavored to set up. Even there, Japan's control was confined to the cities and the railway lines. Outside these it was challenged by guerrilla bands that professed allegiance to the nationalist government. The Communists were particularly successful in using guerrilla methods to resist Japan. The rapid Japanese advances broke down the established patterns of politico-military control. Communist troops and organizers moved into the vast rural areas behind Japanese lines. They organized village self-defense units, created local governments, and expanded their own armies. The 8th Route Army, operating in the mountains and plains of North China, and the new 4th Army in the lower Yangtze Valley. Stalemate. During the stalemate phase of the war, beginning in 1939, Japan tried to subdue Chinese resistance by blockade. China's main seaports were occupied, from the south to the north. In at least one, Fuzhou, Fuzhou, the occupation was only intermittent, but in most of them it was continuous. When, in 1940, France fell to the Germans, Japan took the occasion to advance in French Indochina and blocked the railroad that led from the coast to Kaohsiung, Kunming, and the highways from the Indo-Chinese coast to the interior. For a time Japan induced the British to close the road that led from Burma, Myanmar, to Kaohsiung in Yunnan, but the Burma Road would reopen and become one of the vital supply lines of the war. Then, following years of increasing tension, came the sudden outbreak of war between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand and Japan on the other. The Japanese, taking advantage of their preparedness and of their favorable geographic position, quickly made themselves dominant on the coasts of East Asia. Their capture of Hong Kong and of Burma in 1942 shut doors by which goods had moved in and out of unoccupied China. The only routes that now remained to connect the Chinese with their allies abroad were the long and poorly constructed roads across Xinjiang, and the air passage from Assam. Corruption on the part of Japanese officials and the skill of blockade runners allowed some goods to trickle through the Japanese lines along the coast. Nationalist China had serious economic and social problems. Lacking modern industry and transport facilities, the western provinces struggled to support the huge armies and the government. The region was crowded with refugees, and some of its cities were bombed. The shortage of manufactured goods and the costs of war brought on inflation, which was intensified by the government's fiscal policy. These factors caused great hardship and encouraged hoarding, speculation, and graft. The army, unable to take the offensive against the superior Japanese forces, steadily deteriorated. In the schools and universities, a shortage of books and equipment, malnutrition, and attempted regimentation by the government all had a deteriorating effect. The government, too, was deeply affected by the war. It had lost its industrial and financial base in East China and the flower of its armies. The strong public support it had enjoyed during the early years of resistance waned and turned to apathy or hostility. The government was blamed for the ills of inflation, corruption, and heavy taxation. When the Communists began to reappear as rivals rather than subordinates, the nationalist government retaliated with repressive measures, which it also applied to other groups. Essentially an authoritarian regime, it tended to become more repressive and less efficient as the war dragged on. Yet with all these difficulties, the Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek's leadership refused to surrender or negotiate with Japan. The scattered areas controlled by the Communist Party and its armies grew during the war until they covered large parts of North and East China. In these border regions and liberated areas, the regime was popular with the people. This was partly the result of economic and social reforms, which improved the conditions of the peasantry, and partly the result of the system of local government, which encouraged wide participation of the public through mass organizations, even though control was held firmly by the party. The army was also popular because of its good discipline and close relations with the common people upon whom it depended for existence. During the stalemate period, relations between the nationalists and the communists were embittered by many military clashes for which each side blamed the other. The communists did everything possible to strengthen themselves, whereas the nationalist government tried to keep them confined by blockade and other means. In effect, the Chinese Civil War was merely submerged, after 1938, in the larger war with Japan. In the occupied regions, Japan tried to win support and lessen its military burden by setting up a puppet regime at Nanking, 1940. To head it, the Japanese selected Wang Qingwei, once an intimate companion of Sun Yat-sen, whose tradition Wang Qingwei professed to be continuing. Japan also went through the motions of restoring to Chinese administration the French concession and the international settlement in Shanghai, which it had taken over after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet Japan was no more successful than it had been previously in inducing many Chinese of ability and integrity to serve in these administrations. Obviously, too, no important step could be taken by these regimes without the approval of the Japanese authorities. Allied influence and the Japanese surrender. In the last phase of the war, from early 1944 to August 1945, some help was beginning to come to China from the outside, chiefly from the United States. War materiel was being flown from India, and Chinese pilots and mechanics were being trained. Japanese strongholds were bombed by US and Chinese planes. In India, the United States also was training and equipping Chinese forces that had taken refuge there after the fall of Burma. Yet the main theater of war was far from China, whose armies by then were too debilitated to play an important part in the final campaigns. The nationalist government had been seriously undermined by 7 years of war and inflation, while the strength of the communists, under Mao Zedong, had grown. As Japan withdrew divisions to fight in the Pacific Islands, the communist armies were able to move in and organize more liberated areas. The danger of fratricidal war in the event of Japan's defeat became obvious. The U.S. government was drawn into China's domestic crisis because the United States had provided the main external supports, financial, military, and diplomatic, for the nationalist government. The United States also had wished for China to take a place as a stabilizing influence in Eastern Asia after the war. In various ways, U.S. representatives in China tried to bring about a reconciliation between the Kuomintang and the Communists. A fundamental difficulty, besides the bitter distrust and intransigence of both Chinese parties, lay in the United States' position of trying to mediate between them while supporting one side, the nationalists, as the government of China. Resumption of hostilities between the nationalists and the communists seemed inevitable, and the fragile peace of the United Front collapsed shortly after the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945. 1. The Second Sino-Japanese War had its roots in decades of tension between the two nations. In contrast to the modernized and highly militarized Japanese, Chinese Republican forces lacked training, equipment and a strong industrial base. 2. Already with a foothold in northern China, and armed with superior military technologies, the Japanese invaded in July 1937. They rapidly occupied the east coast of China in 1938–39. 3. The Japanese used inhumane and sadistic methods during their occupation of China, typified by events like the Nanjing Massacre and their use of human experimentation. 4. Zhang Jieshi was widely criticized for his wartime leadership, for placing more importance on the struggle against the communists than the Japanese. He also led a corrupt government plagued by economic issues and failed to work effectively with China's foreign allies. 5. The war left the nationalist government in a vulnerable position, while the CCP managed to consolidate and expand their support, placing them in a more favorable position as China moved toward civil war. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with more historical insights.